Over the course of the morning, we've heard several individual perspectives about America's future, and this afternoon we'll turn to group discussions on some of the major trends facing America. This first panel will focus on demographics, immigration, and economic growth. And as you've learned already this morning, we have broad changes coming in the composition of the workforce and the cycle of retirement. And this group will help us understand the implications for U.S. fiscal policy, for the economy as a whole, as well as the next generation. So we have a distinguished panel. We have Congressman Peter Roskam of Illinois, the Chief Deputy Whip of the House Majority, Congressman Xavier Becerra of California, the Chair of the House Democratic Caucus, New York Times columnist David Brooks, and Janet Murguía, President and CEO of the National Council of Raza. Moderating the discussion will be Peter Cook, Bloomberg Television's Chief Washington Correspondent. Please welcome them to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're enjoying lunch and the day so far. I'm Peter Cook with Bloomberg Television, and pleased to have this panel up here to talk about some daunting issues as well beyond simply fiscal policy. We're going to get immigration into the mix today. We're really going to spice it up. And again, appreciate the Peterson Foundation inviting me to participate and to be part of this fiscal summit. Please continue to enjoy your lunch as we get up here and talk about, again, some big issues confronting the country and the nation's fiscal challenges, specifically America's aging population, the changing demographics in America, what that means for America and for policymakers like our two congressmen here. And let me begin by asking each of you, and Janet, I'm going to begin with you on the end, to paint a picture of America for us. We had a futurist speaking earlier. We had two forward thinkers in Bill Gates and Bill Clinton speaking earlier. So I'm going to ask you to look ahead to the future. Describe America in 2030. What do we look like in 2030? How different is it from today?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And the fact is that if you look out ahead into the future, you see the results of our changing demographics, which, as we know, are occurring today. Latinos represented 50% of the growth in the last census. And we're seeing now that that cohort of Hispanics already is reflected in our pipeline, if you will, of future when it comes to the future workforce. So 1 out of every 4 children under the age of 18 is Hispanic. So when you look out into the future at 2030, starting in 2030, you're going to see a quarter of the workforce reflected by the Hispanic community. And by 2050, a third of the workforce will be reflected in the Hispanic community. So you'll see a huge growth in that workforce represented by a cohort of our population. And I think the key question for us right now is knowing that, and knowing that that cohort has already started. What are we doing now to make sure they're best prepared to enter that workforce? And what are we doing as it relates to education and making the right investments? We, as an organization at the National Council of Raza, fundamentally understand, and even as a community, Latino community, understand that we all have to do our part when it comes to looking at the future of our economy and when it comes to the deficit situation, and even as it relates to entitlement reform. So we do believe in shared sacrifice, but we also understand that we have to make key investments now in order to make sure that we are able to have a strong, functioning, and competitive economy, and that is one that is cognizant of that cohort that will be representative of the workforce.
Congressman Roskam, your view of America 2030, and as someone who has to make some decisions right now, how important is it for you and your fellow colleagues in Congress, the decisions you make today in terms of the picture of America in 2030 that your kids will be living in?
So my wife and I have 4 children, and it's not lost on me that the decisions that we're making are legacy decisions. But I'm very upbeat about where I think the United States is going to be in 2030. And there's a transition that is beginning to happen that we as a nation are making slowly, but it's a transition of an economic reality that reflects this: that we've got to deal with entitlement programs and get a fiscal house in order to create competitiveness. Now, those all sound like bumper stickers on the back of a car. I recognize that. But if you look at where our national debate has gone, for the past 3 years, for example, we've had a national debate that is centered around trying to get Medicare on a pathway that is solvent and begins to make sense. We're having a national debate. Javier and I are part of the Ways and Means Committee, a national debate moving away from one of the least competitive tax jurisdictions in the world, that is our own tax code, which is a disaster and indefensible, to a much more competitive tax code. So I think that the direction that the country is going, a recognition about the nature of these challenges, and not avoidance behavior that says we're not going to deal with this, but being led in some ways by states that we all come from in some cases, that have taken on incredible fiscal challenges, made very difficult decisions, but on the other side of that, there is a buoyancy and an opportunity that I think the federal government can learn from. So I'm upbeat about 2030. I think that this is going to be the place to be. We've got a dynamic economy that we need to feed and grow, but we can do it, and I think we're poised to do it.
Congressman Becerra, are you as optimistic?
Peter, I am, and let me first begin by thanking the Peterson Foundation for constantly keeping us at the forefront of this, bringing us to the table, making us talk about these things, even if we don't always agree. I'm not only an optimist, but I think in order to know where I'll be in the future, where I'm going, I need to know where I came from. And I know where I'm going because, like Peter, I have 3 daughters, and I have one with a ungodly 3.85 GPA or something along those lines, and she's going to be heading to my alma mater at Stanford University soon. And if she just looks back one generation, she'll look at a grandfather who had a chance to go to about the 6th grade, who's an immigrant, worked most of his life with his hands. His wife didn't come to this country till she was 18, from Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico. And if you take a look at what I see before me in my daughters and what I had before me in my parents, this country has done dramatic things, phenomenal things. So for me, life is good. I am very optimistic. And so what I hope we'll do, and what will become a knowledge-based economy, is not forget, we need the infrastructure to help people learn the knowledge. And that means you need people like my dad, who did all his life the building of America. And if we do that, if we remember to once again reward work, which I think we've forgotten to do in this country, otherwise wages wouldn't be so stagnant as they are today, then I believe we're going to revive the middle class, because that dream of owning your own home, of having a chance to send your kids to college with a 6th grade education, so long as you work very hard, are evaporating today. And I believe that there's still a lot of Americans who would like to be able to do the same thing. And my final thought, if we're smart today, we'll finally fix our broken immigration system, because by the time we're looking at 2030, 2050, about 8 out of every 10 of the folks you see in the workforce will have come since this decade from immigrants or their offspring. And so if we're smart, we'll make the right investments, we'll fix our broken immigration system, and once again, we'll become the leader for the world.
David Brooks, your view of America 2030, as optimistic as the 2 congressmen?
No, doomed. We're doomed. Take it to a journalist. Let me start by just telling, I want to make one point, and to start by telling a story. My grandfather, when I was a kid, he drew me a map of his neighborhood on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And what struck me about the map, which I still remember to this day, was he would describe different buildings and which ethnicities lived in those buildings. And so there were Finns in one building, Norwegians in another, Swedes in another. He made ethnic distinctions that most of us would never occur to us to make. But it sort of makes sense in that day to make that distinction, because if you were a Finn, you probably read the Finnish paper, you worked at a Finnish company, your social club was a Finnish social club. But as these groups became assimilated into the country, the salience of those ethnic distinctions became less. And so to me, one of the questions is, does today's immigration look like earlier waves of immigration? Will the salience of some of the ethnic divisions we have now in determining your career, your income, your education level become less salient? And experts disagree on this. I think the evidence is today's immigration looks a lot like earlier waves of immigration. And that the salience of some of these ethnicities will become less important, while the heterogeneity within the immigrant groups will become greater. So knowing you're Hispanic or white or black will become less important. Knowing whether you completed college will become more important. And so when I look at the future and whether to be optimistic or pessimistic, I have to know what education class you're in. If you're in a highly educated class, you're basically living in Ozzie at Harriet land. You've got 1950s marriage rates, 1950s divorce rates. People with college degrees invest on average $5,000 more per kid per year in extracurricular activities. Those people are doing phenomenally well. If you're in the less educated class, and we know the numbers, if you're African American, 72% births out of wedlock. Latino, I think it's about 65. Whites with a high school degree, it's 55. That's an entirely different culture. So one point I'd want to make is we know about the aging, we know about the diversity, but the key fact about our future is not going to be the ethnicity, and it's not going to be the aging. It's going to be the social bifurcation along educational lines.
Well, looking at the nation's fiscal future, let's get right into the immigration reform debate, because there are implications, and it's the hot topic even in the last 24 hours, thanks to the Heritage Foundation. Its analysis of what immigration reform might mean for the nation's fiscal future. $6.3 trillion was the price tag they put on it. Obviously, had a lot of folks disagree with that. David Brooks, your own sense right now, again, you think this looks a lot like the previous waves, which have been a plus for the American economy. At the end of the day, is immigration reform, would it be a plus for America's fiscal future?
Yes, I mean, if we pass immigration reform, I think it's an easy plus. Economically, in terms of skills, in terms of assimilation, to me, it's an easy call. Whether the Republican Party agrees with me is an open question, having less to do with the evidence of whatever numbers you gin up at a Heritage report than the strength of the correlation of forces within the Republican Party. Is this a corporate party or is it a populist party? And if it's a corporate party, then we will get immigration reform. I think it's much more of a populist party than it used to be 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So I put the chances of immigration reform. I used to think it was 70-30 we'd get it. I now think it's 50-50 because I've been impressed by how strong the opponents have organized and how strong a populist party, how hard it is for a populist party to resist the pull of a dedicated, fervent minority who wants to beat this thing.
Janet,
I have deep respect and admiration for Mr. Brooks, but I would not characterize as the choice for Republicans in terms of immigration as to whether you're a corporate party or a populist party. I think, do you want to be a relevant party in this country today and going forward into the future, or do you not want to be relevant? And to me, that is the bigger choice before you start bifurcating among sectors and who's going to win and who's not going to win. To me, I think immigration is a win-win across the board. And if we're looking forward into the future, we need to embrace this cohort of immigrants that have been out in the shadows for a generation. But more importantly, we do need to reform our broken legal immigration system so that it can be dynamic and responsive to those who can come in and make the contributions that we know they have made in the past, and do so in a regular, orderly, and rational fashion. So for us, it really is for the Republicans a choice as to whether they want to be relevant, because when you look at the electorate and when you look at the country in the future, we need to understand not only the power and influence of the Latino vote, something that I'm proud that we were able to move forward, but we really have to look at what are the needs of this country as we move forward, and we need a dynamic workforce. And we've seen that the immigrant workforce time and again has been one that has come in and made the contributions and has invested in the future of this country. So for me, it's essential that we have immigration reform, and the reports that were provided by the Heritage Foundation this morning have been discredited, not just by groups like mine, but you have Grover Norquist and Cato and others who are saying, Governor Haley Barbour, former governor of Mississippi, who are saying that that is absolutely untrue. The data that they used was not sound data, and we have Republican economists who have testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee who have said that immigration reform will be a boon to this economy, and we will see a contribution at least of $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years if we're able to pass immigration reform.
I used the word corporate, but at the Peterson Foundation, that's a compliment. I meant it as a compliment.
Sorry. Congressman Roskam? To the extent,
a lot of material there.
A lot of material for you to weigh in on there. But so let me get you just on the fiscal impact of the immigration reform debate. To what extent is that going to dictate what happens to immigration reform, for example, in the House?
I think there's no doubt that immigration is a boon and a plus to this economic situation that we're in. So this notion that somehow immigration is a net drag, I don't think that when the dust all settles, that's going to get any sort of traction. I think that argument largely gets marginalized. The question then becomes, how do you get to yes? So you've got a national consensus that says the immigration system is broken. There's really no voice that's out defending the status quo. Nobody is saying the 1986 Act was fantastic. We've had two presidents that have tried to approach this in a comprehensive way, both of whom have failed. President George W. Bush used all kinds of political stick to get this done. He couldn't get it done. President Obama, at least at the beginning of his term, talked about wanting to do a comprehensive approach. That has failed. And so now the question is, how do you get to yes? And I am a proponent of breaking this down into a smaller component. I know I am a 1 in 4 vote here for breaking this down, and my panelists, I would assume, are all in favor of a comprehensive system. But you'll notice that one of the titles that I have is this obscure title that means nothing to anybody except other members of Congress, Chief Deputy Whip. And my experience is that when you're going and you're talking to a member of Congress and you say, hey, I'm looking for a yes vote on here, the bigger, the more complicated, and the more stuff you've got in a bill, the easier it is for somebody to say, no, I'm a no. And if you want to get to yes, it's very clear to me. You want to get to yes, break this down. There's 218 votes in the House for a tough border bill. There's 218 votes in the House for the high wattage visas. There's 218 votes in the House for a guest worker program. There's 218 votes in the House for people who want to get right with the law who are currently here. The thing is, they're all different votes. And if you create a roll call where you've got to have one big bill, I'm telling you, my prediction is that we get nothing. Two presidents are 0 for 2 on this. I think we've got to look at our process. This isn't avoidance behavior, but it's just the reality of my experience that says if it's an all or nothing game in this town, you get nothing every time.
Congressman Becerra, Heritage, and they're talking about their report yesterday. They talked about Social Security, Medicare. You add 11.5 million people to those rolls after this 13-year period, whatever. That's going to come with a price tag.
Well, fortunately, the lefties at Cato discredited the report at the Heritage Institution. And I will simply say this. The immigrants are so far ahead of the politicians on this. And quite honestly, so is the American public. For probably now going on close to a decade, the American public has said, let's fix this system. Let's fix what's broken, including dealing with those folks that we know we can't deport them all, many of whom clean my home, take care of my grandmother. They want us to fix it. Those immigrants didn't worry about what we were going to say today. They got up to go to work at 5 a.m. this morning, and they will probably finish after we're done as well. And they're just going to keep working. And for them, it's just churning forward. My father, as a road construction worker, he knew every fall he was about to lose his job because in road construction in Sacramento, California, it rains in the winter. And so guess what? In the winter, you can't do road construction. He didn't stop working simply because there was no road construction to do. He always hustled. I never saw my father at home without work. And so those immigrants are going to keep working. They're going to keep building. And sooner or later, the politicians will catch up with the American public who have said, you really want to build this country. And if you do, then you've earned a place. We'll deal with the border. We'll deal with the workplace. But we have to deal with that population of folks who's working very hard here because it's good for our economy. Not because it's good for them, because it's good for our economy. And by the way, when they can come out of the shadows and they can have their income out in the open, no longer in the underground economy, guess what? Even though a number of them are already paying taxes, they'll all start paying taxes. And guess what? When Social Security tells you that it has about a $250 billion suspense account of money they can't account for to whom it should go because there's no name attached to the work that was done to pay for that Social Security benefit, they'll start to realize who those folks are. These folks aren't going to ask for anything. My father never asked for anything. They're going to earn their way. And the sooner the politicians recognize that, the more ready this country will be to launch once again to lead the world. And that's why people will always want to come first to America.
Immigration reform, not in and of itself enough to deal with the nation's entitlement programs, even if we get more folks paying those taxes that you talked about. We're talking about 11,000 people a day right now being added to Medicare. We're talking about some 80 million baby boomers set to retire in the next little bit. Congressman Roskam, right now, it doesn't seem like Washington's really prepared for that challenge. Is there any movement whatsoever to try and deal with this issue?
I think so. So if you go back, I made this reference to 3 years what the House has done. So on behalf of the House Republican majority, a decision was made to take Medicare, a very popular program, and wrestle it to the ground. Now, when I first got into public life, if you would listen to consultants on Medicare, this is what they'd say. They'd say, hey man, on Medicare, here's what you say. You're for it. And then change the topic. Because if you get into it, so the magic words were support, protect, and defend Medicare. And then you'd be in and out like a commando, and you're done with it and talking about something else. The House majority made a different decision, and that was to say, okay, Medicare will be insolvent in 12 years. Let's wrestle this to the ground. We'll go out, we'll take it to the country, come back, we retain the majority, and we've been able to demonstrate that it's no longer the third rail. That's good progress. Now, I would argue that the movement that we've seen on the White House side as it relates to change CPI is basically a response to that says, okay, those guys are out on the ice jumping up and down saying that Medicare is okay. Maybe we can go out on Social Security too. So there's some progress, Peter, I think. It's not dispositive. It's not all come together, but there is some progress that I think we need to recognize as progress as opposed to obstacles where we're talking past each other.
Our panelists have any thoughts on that? Is Washington ready to confront this, Congressman?
I would agree with Peter that we can confront this. I would disagree a little bit. I would simply point out 2 facts. One, the cost of Medicare for Americans has been going up at a slower rate than the cost of private insurance health care has been for the general public. So in the private sector, health care costs are going up faster than they are in Medicare. Why we would then say that the way to solve the problems for Medicare is to have it become just like the private sector health care system goes beyond me. What you want to try to do is corral the cost of health care overall in the system. That helps control private sector costs as well as Medicare costs. 2, Social Security. How much have we invested in Social Security in our 77 plus years since 1935 as Americans who work and pay FICA taxes? $14.5 trillion. In those 77 plus years, how much have we as Americans taken from the Social Security system in benefits and administrative costs? $13.5 trillion. How much have those trillions of dollars that have been put into Treasury bonds earned over the decades? $1.5 trillion. $2.5 trillion that Social Security has never had a touch to pay to beneficiaries. Now, in about a quarter of a century, we're going to use up that trust fund money, and we will have to deal with the challenge that we face with Social Security, where it can only pay about 75 cents on the dollar of what today's seniors are receiving in benefits. But we're now dealing about a worry a quarter of a century from now. Today, we're talking about budget deficits that were created in the past. And so the difficulty for some of us is when we talk about cutting benefits, whether through the change CPI or anything else for Social Security, to deal with today's deficits and the $16, $18 trillion debt that we have today, when Social Security in its 77-plus year history has never added a single penny to the national debt or any one single deficit in any year of our history. And that's important to remember, because through 77-plus years, 13-plus recessions, Social Security has never failed to pay in full and on time. And what we would not want to do is destroy the most important of the 3 legs of that retirement program that people have to rely on: their savings, their pension, and Social Security.
David, the math suggests we can't afford it right now. As Speaker Boehner said, we're broke.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're quite broke. Here's my deal. I know the answer to all this because I'm a columnist, having run for office exactly 0 times. So we've got 2 large problems. The first is an immediate problem of collapsing middle class and the social fabric decay that I talked about. And to solve that problem, we probably need a little more domestic discretionary spending. And if those of you who follow domestic discretionary know that it's historically about 3 or 4% of GDP, but because it's being squeezed out by Medicare, it'll drop over the next 7 years under the Obama budget. Instead of 3 or 4% of GDP, it'll drop to about 2.3% of GDP, just crunching domestic discretionary. So that's a short-term problem. The long-term problem is the long-term entitlement problem, the Medicare problem that everyone in this room knows about. So to me, the deal is easy. The Republicans give the Democrats domestic discretionary, higher domestic discretionary spending over the short term. The Democrats give the Republicans some means testing of Medicare, some structural entitlement reform over the long term. And to me, each party gets something. We help address our social fabric problem. We help address our long-term debt problem. And we probably have shorter deficits over the short term, but we make it up for the lower debt over the long term. That's my solution.
Janet, he makes it sound really easy, doesn't he?
Well, look, these are the experts here. I would just make some observations, particularly as it relates to the largest growing segment of the American population, and that's the Hispanic community. And I would say that when it comes to entitlement reform, we know more than anybody how important it is to preserve these programs. Latinos rely singularly on Social Security at the end of the system, for their single source of income. So we know it is important to have that there for the future. On the front end, again, I'll remind you that because of the demographic shifts, we also know that it will be Hispanics who will make up a large part of that workforce that will need to be prepared to keep that entitlement reform supported in the way that it needs to be, and to keep the Social Security around as a program the way that it needs to be. And I guess I would just argue for making sure that we're taking the long-term view and understanding, yes, we do need to make balanced, fair, and shared investments in that, and sacrifices around it. But I would still argue that there are certain investments we can still be making today that would ensure those programs being around, especially as it relates to that cohort. And to me, investments like early childhood education, to make sure that this Hispanic cohort that's running through the pipeline already, the education pipeline right now, is as successful as they can be. There may be other key investments, but we know early childhood education exponentially grows the opportunity for our young people to be successful. We should be making some clear-cut investments, targeted, that are strategic right now to ensure that workforce is fully engaged and prepared to be competitive.
Can I ask you a quick? Why doesn't your organization lobby for Medicare structural reform so there'll be more money for early childhood?
We would. We have said that we're prepared to look at any entitlement program and look at those reforms and see what we need to do, because we understand that we have to be invested. I'm just saying that it has to be fair, balanced, and shared sacrifice. But we understand we can't say, you all do this and we can't be affected by it. We are primarily affected by it, and we're willing to be key players. Quite frankly, not a lot of people are asking these days. So I welcome the chance to be part of this conversation.
And if I could just add very quickly, we did do structural reform in Medicare. We can do more, but we did do structural reform to the point of getting $700 billion over the next 10 years in savings scored by the Congressional Budget Office. Many of those reforms caused the defeat of a lot of Democrats when we passed those reforms in the Affordable Care Act, because we were accused of having cut Medicare for seniors. But what we did was we made it a much slimmed down version of Medicare, where we said, instead of reimbursing physicians and hospitals for every procedure they do, we're going to start reimbursing you for the outcomes you provide, so that you have to make sure that the person from the first door you enter at the primary care physician's office to the last door you exit, hopefully healthy, from, say, that nursing home, that you have increased your outcomes, your health outcomes, they've gotten better, versus just saying, primary care physician, I saw you, I get reimbursed. Where you go next to the specialist, I don't care whether you go to the hospital. And so that's why we were able to extract about $700 billion in savings. Those are real reforms that are beginning to play out as we speak.
I know you got a different take on
Listen,
those.
I would like to waste my time by raising my hand. Apparently, so I don't want to take the bait and relitigate the Affordable Care Act, because I want to make this other point on David's point on the crowding out. My home state of Illinois, from a fiscal point of view, has become a national punchline. The Springfield made a bad choice, and when there was an urgent fiscal situation, from my point of view, they went to the old playbook, raised taxes, the taxes underperformed, $10 billion in unpaid bills, second amount per capita debt than any state in the union. We've got a $100 billion unfunded pension liability, higher than average unemployment, 9.5%. And I'm beginning to sound like Debbie Downer on the land of Lincoln. And it's all based on bad decisions and avoidance behavior. So if we're going to have a remedy to be able to invest in those types of things, and there's nobody that doesn't say there's things that are worthy of investing in and have a disproportionate payout, the brokenheartedness, though, comes when people decide, hey, we don't have to deal with this. And I know that's not what you're arguing, but it's like so clear to me. So I represent a state now, and my constituents are saying, hey, how come my bill to go downtown Chicago from a commuter point of view just went up 30%? How come it costs me almost as much to send my child paying in-state to the University of Illinois as it does to go out of state to Indiana University? And it's all based on avoidance, avoidance, avoidance. And then all of a sudden, we're surprised when we're losing the economic game, and all of these pressures crash down, and there's less discretionary, less to fight about, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Let's try and wrap this up a little bit, looking again to the future, trying to tie this into the fiscal debate and the education question, David, that you raised. The notion that if you got an education in this country, your chances down the road much better. If you are an immigrant coming to this country with an education, a lot more opportunities for you. The jobs of the future. How do we make the investments to make sure people are employed in those jobs that actually pay well, have them paying taxes and helping the fiscal outlook down the road? Can we afford that right now, given everything else going on, David?
Well, I would say yes. I mean, one of the nice things I wrote in my column today about a guy named Richard Alba, who did this analysis of boomer retirements. And so over the next 30 years, the boomers are going to be leaving the workforce, opening up massive open slots. And so he looks at the sorts of jobs they're leaving, who is filling them. And the good news is that it's demographically what you would hope for. That Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, whites, everyone's filling them at a very good rate, including the very high-skilled jobs. And so there's a lot to be optimistic about, but obviously you have to get there. And the bottom line, you have to pay for the education. And so the bottom line about human capital is that it's like nutrition. You have to do it every day, and it has to start early. Learners learn, skill begets skill. So to me, you just have to have a diet of nurse-family partnerships for disorganized neighborhoods at the first days of life, and then early childhood education, then charter schools, then mentoring programs, then community colleges. I mean, you just throw the kitchen sink at it. And that's an investment worth making, as long as we're not spending all our money on health care for the affluent elderly.
And we're also paying interest on the debt, which is only going to rise, Congressman Becerra. How do you make these investments in the education that you want to see for your children?
How did we do it after World War II and had the GI Bill? How did we send a man on the moon when times were tough right in the 50s and 60s? We do it because we know we can, and that's what makes America great. How does a guy who's got a 6th grade education believe that in the future, when he could not walk into a restaurant because of the sign that said no dogs or Mexicans allowed, that his son would become a man who could walk him through the doors of the White House to meet the President of the United States? Or that his granddaughters are now, as my daughter Olivia is planning to do, chemical engineering? You just got to give them a chance. If you want to work in this country, we should reward you. And so while we will become a knowledge-based economy, no longer an industrial-based economy, we have to remember someone still has to build that factory. Someone still has to build the school. And if you remember that, then you're going to remember someone like my father who built those things and still dreams that maybe not him, but through his children or his children's children, he'll have a chance to see that American dream. That's what makes this country so great. And it doesn't take a lot of investing. We still have the money to put the dollar where it counts. And I got to believe, even during these toughest fiscal times, we know what it takes to be smart, because you don't have to be totally intelligent and get a 4.8 GPA to be able to build for America as my dad did.
Congressman Roskam, your take on this as we wrap things up? Well, Janet, you'll be next.
I was in South Korea a couple of years ago and met with their chairman of their Foreign Relations Committee, and I was asking him advice. How do you interact with China? You've been living in this relationship on the Korean Peninsula for years. And with no sense of irony, he said to me, you know, Congressman, the first thing I'd do is I'd stop borrowing their money. That's what I'd do. And I think that there is a lesson here, and there's a thread that brings all four of these perspectives together, and that is live within our means, be proactive, don't talk past one another. And also, the subtext of all this is don't underestimate the entrepreneurship of Javier's father or Janet's constituents or anything. You know what I mean? There's this sort of presumption that somehow we're going to come up with a stinking government program that's going to create growth and opportunity. It's not going to happen. It is that dynamic spirit that says, I want to go to the United States of America. The United States of America is the only country that is an idea. I want to be a part of that idea. And that's where things grow and become prosperous.
Janet, you get the final word.
Oh, thank you. And I just, with Javier talking about his family, I'll tell you just my story. My parents came to this country from Mexico. My dad had a 7th grade education. My mom a 5th grade education. They had 7 kids. There were 9 of us in a little bitty house with 1 bathroom. And, you know, my dad ended up working in a steel plant. My mom would help in different odd jobs along the way. And, you know, they really believed in the promise of this country. And even though they didn't have much of an education, they knew how important it would be for us kids. And so my brother Ramon went to Harvard Law School. My brother Carlos went to law school, became a United States Federal District Court judge. My sister Mary went to law school and became a United States Federal District Court judge and now sits on the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. And I worked in the Clinton White House and graduated from law school. I know what we can do in this country if given that chance. And that's what we need. We need to make sure we're making a good vet, not only on these immigrants who are here and ready to engage and contribute, but I'm telling you, you can also make a good bet on this Hispanic community that really wants to make a contribution, and we're willing to play our part and carry our weight, and we're willing to weigh in when it comes to these big issues around entitlement reforms. We don't want a free ride, we just want a chance to contribute and to really be part of full participants in this society.
On that note, our time clock has expired. Thanks for listening. Thanks, panelists, for engaging, and to be continued, for sure.
Thank you.